Thor Love and Thunder has hit theaters, so it's time to stop and rank all 4 theatrical Thor films from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of all 4 theatrical Thor films. My list isn't the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours. And let's get started. Coming in last place is Thor: The Dark World. The most epic thing about this film is how mediocre it turned out to be, and for inexplicable reasons. Because if you look at the talent in front of and behind the camera, there's simply no excuse or reason for why this movie is so blah. It was directed by one of the key directors in the early seasons of Game of Thrones that won plenty of acclaim as a director of that show that was very cinematic. The screenplay was written by the guys that wrote Infinity War and Endgame. So they can write great Marvel films. And then, of course, in front of the camera, you have a bunch of actors and actresses that have done amazing things in other films, even as these characters. But here in this movie, none of it pops. None of it is memorable. The most memorable thing about this film is how forgettable it actually is. And it's a little bit tough to pinpoint what exactly went so wrong with this film. A big problem here is that the villain has absolutely nothing distinct or unique or memorable about him. He's just a dark elf that wants the ether. Do you want me to describe his personality? Anything specific about him? I can't do it. I couldn't even identify him in a lineup. He just looks like all the other ones, despite being acted by a former Doctor Who. So obviously this guy has screen presence and has been a part of a major franchise. But here he's just totally generic dark elf. From there, you have a plot that on the one hand, it's not actually very complex. It's fairly straightforward. But at the same time, the way the story is told, the order in which information is communicated, the way that it plays out is actually kind of confusing. It's not entirely clear exactly what's happening and why it's happening, despite it not actually being all that complex. And that's a sign that you just have really bad storytelling taking place where there's just no reason that it's unclear exactly what is taking place at specific times. Also, it's a movie that can't seem to decide exactly what it's going for. So it kicks off, and the first part of it feels like epic Lord of the Rings in space, with this history of these cosmic powers and Thor battling these huge creatures. And then it cuts to Jane, and it's like a rom-com. It's like a comedy about this date that she's on. And then later on, when Loki shows up and teams up with Thor, it's a buddy comedy. And then we've got fake deaths for Loki. That's like this tragic moment where he dies and then it's undone by the time the credits roll. And a big third act finale that's not particularly exciting, looks kind of drab. So a movie that it's slick superficially. You got talented actors, shots look expensive, they're in focus, but they're not all that good. They're not all that memorable. There's nothing here to latch onto, to fall in love with. There's also not all that much there here to hate either. It's just slick blockbuster stuff that you'll forget about instantly as soon as you watch it. Originally, Patty Jenkins was signed on to direct this film, and she had this whole other idea. It was going to be like Romeo and Juliet in space or something like that. And then they had creative differences, and then we moved on to Alan Taylor, Game of Thrones guy. And I don't know if her movie would have been much better, and it would have brought in that distinct flair that was missing from the one that we got. But the movie that they released is arguably, very easily arguably, the worst film in the MCU. Certainly the most utterly mediocre. Up next, the new one, Thor Love and Thunder. And this movie looks to go down in history as one of the most polarizing films in the MCU. It came out just a few days ago, and its cinema score is a B+, which a B+ is actually a pretty low cinema score for a blockbuster. In fact, a B+ means it is tied for second lowest. The lowest is Eternals with a B, and then Thor Doctor Strange 2 and Thor Love and Thunder have a B+, so tied for second lowest. Thor the Dark World even has an A-, better cinema score than this film. Critics on Rotten Tomatoes, that aggregate has it as, I think, the fourth or fifth lowest scored film in the MCU. And then a bunch of people are loving this film. A bunch of people think it's hilarious, it's heartfelt, it ends on a huge emotional note, and so it is absolutely working for them. And I think at the end of the day, it boils down to, can you buy into Taika Waititi's irreverent, comedy-heavy take on Thor? If you're still down for it, if you love what he's doing in this film, this is probably a movie that you thoroughly enjoy, and therefore it's way up there on your MCU ranking. But I think for a lot of us, certainly me included, it's just too much. And Thor Ragnarok, obviously higher up on this list. I really dug that film. We'll talk about it in just a second. And this feels like they just took off all the restraint and doubled down on the stuff that was already skirting the edge of going too far. And instead of edging it too far, the whole thing is just always too far. So the movie starts off and you have Thor literally doing Jean-Claude Van Damme spinning flip kicks. Here I am! And then he accidentally crumbles down this building because he's a total idiot. And then goats start screaming. If you saw that stuff in the trailer, the screaming goats and the split kicks, and you were like, that looks awesome, you probably loved this film. I saw that in the trailer and I went, oh no, they're going to go too far. And I watched the movie and I felt like they just went too far. You have a love triangle between Thor, Mjolnir, and Stormbreaker that just, I'm seeing that on screen. I'm like, they have never given a personality to the Hammers like this before. They've never been these characters that are getting jealous and insecure in this nature. Thor has kind of had a relationship with, kind of talked with his Hammers, but the Hammers themselves haven't acted like they're trying to woo him in this manner. And so it just plays like a parody of Thor. And if this was a parody of Thor, if this was a movie that was separate from the MCU, like Taika Waititi, yeah, go ahead and make a comedy making fun of our franchise, I would probably thoroughly enjoy this film. Because it's just poking fun at some of the silliness of the lore and the character. But it's not a parody. It's an actual Thor film that is treating the character entirely as a joke. And playing it so over the top. With the hammers and the love triangle, with the flippy kicks, with how much of a doofus and an idiot the Thor is, that it just undermines too much of the credibility of the film. And I think it plays very odd when you contrast that with Jane is dying of cancer, Gor's daughter has died, and he's out to kill all the gods because the gods don't actually care about us. That's a strange blend. Parody Thor, Jane dying of real-world cancer, a thing that we deal with in reality, and then very theologically rich, philosophically rich motivation for our villain. I don't think they went all together. I don't think we explored all this stuff with Gore. The stuff with Gore's great. It's awesome. There's just not enough up with it, and they could have done more with it. And so it's a movie for me that, did it make me laugh? Yeah, it did. But do I feel like I should be laughing about screaming goats in a Thor film? No, I don't think I should be laughing about that. Do I think I should be laughing because I got to see Chris Hemsworth's butt in a Thor film? No. Should Zeus be a total joke? No, I don't think so. And that's where, for me, this movie just, it's entertaining. It's not boring, but it came at the expense of credibility and having some respect for the source material. And this is where Taika Waititi's irreverence at a certain point in time is just too much for me. And that's what this movie was. Just too irreverent for its own good. And especially with a movie that had the potential to be something much better. With the Jane plot line, with the philosophical questions raised by Gore, with a great actor like Christian Bale in that part. And it's just undone for me by too much humor that's too silly. Our runner-up, the original Thor. And to me, this movie is a little bit like the MCU in its awkward phase, where they're trying to figure out how do we tell a story about a space god that ends up on Earth that fits in the same universe as Iron Man? And there's a lot that kind of goes into like massaging the tone and the vibe to try and get it right. And this movie doesn't quite nail it, but it does a lot of things really, really well. Just can be a bit awkward as we're figuring out how to do all this stuff. So on the positive side, they brought in Kenneth Branagh, who has this very rich history of directing lots of Shakespeare adaptations as well as other types of bigger films. And I think he brought that Shakespearean grandeur, certainly to the Asgard sequences where they feel large and majestic and royal and Shakespearean. Even, of course, the plot between Thor, Loki, Odin, very Shakespearean in nature. And so getting someone like Kenneth Branagh to tackle all of that, I think works really well. Cast here, pretty incredible. You got the legacy actors and like Anthony Hopkins, Rene Russo kind of being Thor's parents and bringing in the weight of known actors of very rich careers, celebrated careers, so that our two leads as our hero and a villain, essentially unknowns. Chris Hemsworth today is this A-lister that everybody knows his name and his very vast filmography. At the time, he was just known for being the guy in the first 10 minutes of Star Trek 2009. And then I'm not sure what Tom Hiddleston had done before this. And so they found the right people that would become beloved in these roles. And because they didn't have any past history, you just see them as Thor and Loki. And then you fill in some of these other spots with, like, of course, Natalie Portman, who was well established as a both dramatic as well as mainstream actress. And so you get a phenomenal cast here. And at its core, you have a pretty profound story about Thor needing to learn humility and shake off the bravado. And they do this by sending him to Earth and humbling him by literally stripping him of his powers. And so there's some profound, powerful things in there. I think the actual villain plot line and conflict there, a little bit ho-hum. Because Thor doesn't know that there's a villain plot going on. He's trying to work through his own stuff. And so he's out on Earth meeting Jane and trying to get his hammer back and has a character arc there. But he doesn't know that there's a villain plot until we're in the third act. Like, oh, I got to get back to Asgard to stop the evil threat. Better get to it. And so it lacks kind of that forward momentum in the way that it's done. Likewise, the tonal shift from Asgard to fish out of water comedy on Earth, where Thor's played for jokes and getting hit by a car and stuff like it's slapstick humor, is pretty abrupt and odd. And some of it's funny, but it just feels like two movies mashed together a little bit. And that's why I say it's a film where you can feel them figuring out how to balance all of this, where they didn't figure out how to have it tonally consistent with all these different parts. But there's a lot of really good stuff in here. A lot of very important decisions were made with this movie, in particular the casting. So this is one that I think some people write off as just kind of early phase one, a little bit forgettable, weaker film. And I don't think it's top tier MCU by any means, but I think it's one that does have a lot to offer. But easily coming in first place for me is Thor Ragnarok. Whereas Thor the Dark World was just utterly drab and forgettable, lacking any distinct style, Thor Ragnarok is the polar opposite of that, just being brought to life by Taika Waititi's big personality. So the colors are bold and bright. The soundtrack pops with all these synthesizers, and the whole thing has this fresh sense of humor that goes right up to the line and normally doesn't go too far. A few times I think it goes too far. A few moments it undercuts the drama by throwing in a joke where we didn't need one. There's a few times it's a bit too irreverent in a moment that needs to be a little bit more dramatic. In particular, the treatment of the Warriors 3, I think that should have been done a little bit better. There's an irreverence there in this movie, and it doubles down on it in Thor Love and Thunder that I don't know what Taika Waititi is doing with that. But otherwise, this is just a really fun and maybe the funniest movie in the MCU that doesn't just turn it into an all-out comedy. A big part of what kind of makes this movie work is that it's able to have stakes and deaths that last and it does it without needing to be a downer of a film. And so Odin dies, but Odin still has a presence later on in the film. We get Ragnarok, the destruction of Asgard as a place, but it intertwines with these themes about how Asgard is so much more than just a place. It has all these kind of, while having all the jokes and the humor, it pauses just enough to have the moments where Thor learns lessons about Asgard, the source of his power, his father's failings, and it makes for just the right mix of all the different pieces. Other fun thing in here, we get Hulk teaming up with Thor in the film that just makes for so many great little moments. And you can feel the MCU figuring out how to use Hulk properly and where you can kind of squeeze him into stories where he's a tough lead character, but he's a great side character, and you get him in this film being used in that way. It provides so many great opportunities on so many different levels. So for me, this was Taika Waititi's bag of tricks done right, with just the right amount of restraint, that it pushes boundaries, but it doesn't cross them perpetually, the way that Thor: The Love and Thunder just exists beyond the boundaries outside of what is reasonable for the character. No, it makes you a little bit uncomfortable. Is it too silly? Nah, it's not too silly. This works. Therefore, it's able to still work as a credible, serious Thor story with heartfelt, emotional moments, and it's totally consistent with itself. So for me, this was a breath of fresh air, and it comes in at number 1. If you enjoyed this video, I've got a ton more Marvel content. You can check it out right over there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye-bye.